This is a quick expedition report before we present a compilation of the year that was. Since the footage of April this year, the AYR have conducted 23 expeditions over South East Queensland. We would have branched further if not for COVID restrictions. We'll cover some of these expeditions in the end of year show. The location of this expedition is set in the Gold Coast hinterland at a place we like to call Garibah. A few weeks prior to our operation, Wade and his son camped on the side of a creek bed in a valley consisting of both Australian fauna and lush rainforest. They had a small fire, cooked sausages and played some low volume music before lights out and hitting the hammocks. During the night, the bush turned noticeably silent. In the distance, they heard a loud tree knock, followed by another. Later, a whooshing noise, similar to a bull roar for communication by the Aboriginals. Another tree knock came from the forest, but this time closer, followed by another whooshing noise, but this time different to the last. At one stage, they heard bipedal footsteps coming through the creek towards them, and more in the forest behind their hammocks. At 1:30 a.m, a small rock hit the trees above them and fell to the ground. Then another impacted the side of a tree. Over a period of the following 15 minutes, Wade estimates 40 rocks were thrown at their camp. But the headline was, according to Wade, there was something, and perhaps plural, walking around their camp throughout the night. A date for the AYR expedition was set. So join us as I say, welcome to Garibah. We arrived at location and ran a team of 6, split into 3 groups of 2. The teams consisted of Gary Lynn and Wade Matthews, Buck Buckingham and Al Newton, or Buck and Al as colloquially coined. Then myself and Steve, the dentist. After Grandma Buckingham snuck some vodka into his energy drink, we did some early recon of the area and discovered a plethora of signs we were hoping for. There's one here, there's one here. They're all facing southeast.
Well, you've got this one here. This one right here.
Oh yeah.
Over there. There's 21 laying against the horizontal over there.
This told us the location had been active for quite some time. The unnatural sticks in the ground, with no branches above. Sticks in the ground, intertwined or locked together. Not natural. Thick sticks broken both ends and placed on the side of trees, most pointing to the southeast. Not natural. X markers. Differing formations. Upside down tree. Let's turn that the right way round. And things like this, alongside things like that. Following these markers is what led us to obtain the footage of April this year. Knowledge and experience is the key. The area showed itself to be active, however, much of it was old. We could only go on Wade's incident report as to when they were last here, and that was recent. With the information gathered, we set 3 camps in a triangular formation. Myself and Steve hauled our gear along the creek to where we naturally dubbed Wade's World, the location where Wade and his son had the action 2 weeks prior. Gary Lynn and Wade Matthews were above the rock escarpment and roughly 100 metres further in the forest. Buck and Al were further up the hill from Gary and Wade. Steve the dentist had a find directly behind Wade's world, where both Wade and his son heard something walking on the night of their encounter. This was a 5-way ensemble. Interesting. We have the fork of this living tree. We have an X marker put in like so. And then we have this one placed in and this one placed in through here. The crew made a surprise visit to learn how the A-Team operates. Time to quickly fix my hair and bring out the good cutlery. We purchased a bull roarer to reproduce many of the sounds Wade experienced. And of course, Moose Lynn destroyed it. After day turned to night, myself and Steve cooked dinner, played some soft music and tried to replicate Wade's activities on the night of his encounter. It was immediately high strangeness. Wood knocks, rock clacks and other non-natural sounds coming from the forest. At one point, Steve had a rock land at his feet. Not long after, a large rock landed in the water directly in front of us, making a loud splash. Did it fall from the granite ledge, or was it deliberately thrown? It didn't tumble down the side of the embankment. It landed clean in the water. And again, it was large and solid. I immediately radioed C2 and C3. Gary aimed his thermal camera towards our location. He then came on the radio saying he had sight of something. It was walking away from our location, along the bush, on top of the granite embankment. From what he could see on the monitor through the foliage, it resembled a neck and a head, bobbing about, walking through the forest.
There came a point where all three teams were back at their own base camps, C1, C2, C3. Dean at C1, at the original base camp 1, where the encounter happened. He came over the radio suddenly and said a rock just got thrown into the creek in front of them. Immediately, I pulled up my thermal camera and pointed up in that general direction. It wasn't long before I picked up on a yellow head-like heat signature bobbing through the trees. I immediately came over the radio asking for confirmation of the whereabouts of Buck and Al, being that in that general direction is where their camp was. They took a little bit longer to respond, so I stood up from my seated position to try and get a better angle and to try and get some more clarity on what I was seeing. Unfortunately, due to the different angles once standing, I lost the subject. Again, this was directly after Dean came over the radio asking if anyone had seen anything, because they just had a rock thrown in the creek. This heat signature, bright yellow, could not miss it through the thermal camera. Quite easily depicted a neck and a head bobbing through the trees.
Before he had time to record, it was gone. Later in the night, Buck and Al thought they heard Gary and Wade approaching them. But as it turned out, Gary and Wade were below, closer to our camp. This left them puzzled.
It was already strange. There was just high strangeness everywhere. Blair Witch type structures. So we're already on a bit of an alert. The whole idea is that we're going to be in a kind of Bermuda Triangle, trying to capture anything that comes in between. While Al and I were sitting down at Buck and Al, Camp Buck and Al, we got a call that something was happening. Well, Dean had radioed first. He'd heard that they'd heard a large splash in the rock pool by their camp. So It was quickly followed by Gary inquiring after our location. Where were we? Were we on the track? And I responded that we're stationary and seated. I got up quickly and I left poor Al in the dark, saying I'll be back soon. And I was only wearing one gaiter at the time, I'm in a gang, the One Gator gang. It was presumed that the unknown intruder would have been between us and Gary and where Dean was at the base of the cliff. I did a quick scope of the track and nothing showed up. And so I waddled off down the road with one gaiter on, and it took a while for each party to locate each other through the thermals. And when Gary and I met up, he told me what had happened, but we decided that we'd go back to camp. I'd grab Al some extra gear and meet up in 5 minutes. So we went down to the bottom of the culvert, which is the entry point for Wadeswell, where Dean and Steve had their base camp. And Gary and Wade followed some noises around to the rear of the camp while we kept checking up and down the creek from the second culvert. And we could make out Dean and Steve scoping the bush, and we could easily make out Gary and Wade circling around the back. Then after a while, we decided that maybe we should go back up the track to our camp. We went way back up the track to a more open vantage point, and from this point we were able to see briefly with our naked eye that Gary and Wade had gone right around the back of Wade's world and come across the creek and were coming up the hill. We could see, fully expected that they would come up the hill and onto the track, and they didn't. But then we could hear some movement in that area, and we were waiting for them to appear when they mentioned that they'd gone across the low ground of the cliff face and back to the culvert. And this was puzzling. Al and I stood there going, well, what was that noise?
The spasmodic wood taps continued, as too the odd rock landing on the ground and sounds of occasional walking. We've set up camp. Gary is up above. Myself and Steve are down in the valley. Got Al and Buck, I don't know where, but we're all reporting on very strange noises. There's a lot of clacking and there's a lot of what sounds like perhaps rocks, but hopefully we'll be in for an interesting night. Myself and Steve hit the hammocks at 1:30 a.m. I woke to the sound of Steve walking behind my hammock and then up the creek. Surprisingly, then, Steve got out of his hammock and stared up at the creek, saying he could hear something walking. Evidently, that wasn't Steve walking behind my hammock. In between noises and micro-sleeps, Steve woke me and said he heard something burst out of the forest onto the creek rocks and began walking towards us. It then walked through water and then back onto the rocks. Steve fumbled for his thermal camera. By the time he was in position with the camera powered up, he'd gone back into the forest, most likely aware of the commotion. This really rattled Steve. In the decades I've spent with Steve in the bush, I've never seen him visibly scared. Not like this. From that point on, he stood like a soldier at attention, camera in hand, staring up the creek. Set up 2 hammocks, we had a barbecue, some light music, and then we went to bed. Exactly the same things were happening. What happened to him? The rocks, the walking up the creek, the noises in the bush behind me this way. And I think we had 2 encounters, 2 visitors, or the same visitor twice. So my hammock was from that tree there to this one here. Steve's was from that across to there. And he couldn't sleep at all because he was hearing a lot of noises, footsteps, etc. And later in the night, I'm lying here having a micro sleep, and I wake up to footsteps round here to the back of my hammock, and then down into the creek and walks up. And I thought that must be Steve, either responding to the call of nature or having a look up the creek after hearing something. And then Steve gets out of his hammock from here, and I'm totally disorientated. I'm going, well, if you just got out of your hammock here, then who? Then later in the night, Steve wakes to say he heard something crash out of the bush behind us here, comes down into the creek, then walks through the water, then back up onto the rocks, and as it's coming right around the bend here, he's fumbling for his thermal camera, and he's got it caught up around his back by a cord. And as he's making all this commotion, it's obviously heard him and then made a detour back into the water. Now behind me is where the rock landed in the water, and we think it came from up this escarpment. Now Gary and Wade, they were up the top of the escarpment, probably about 100 metres back into the bush. Now Gary picked up his thermal, he wasn't recording, he was just having a look, and he sees what looked like a neck and shoulders going through the bush behind the foliage in that direction.
But it just doesn't make sense in a natural aspect that you have that rock land in the water. A clean splash in the water doesn't hit it on the way down. As soon as you come over the radio and say that you had the rock land in the water, from our position to the south, I'll pull the thermal camera up straight away and look up in this general direction. And I see a bright yellow head-shaped heat signature bobbing through the trees. Pretty much exactly like that. I couldn't really see too much of the body. It was more this round head, lower neck type heat signature, very bright in colour yellow. And when I rode through the buck and to ask, where are you guys? That took a bit longer than I was hoping to get back to me, so I asked again. The whole time still watching this headlight heat signature bounce through the trees, and they still didn't say anything. And I said to Wade, let's get up, let's go. As soon as we took off and I stood up, I lost it. So just different angles from seated to standing. I unfortunately lost where the signature was, and when we got up there was nothing. And then Buck and Al come over the radio and said, we're still at base camp. And when we got up to the location roughly where I spotted this heat signature, we still could not see Buck and Al through the thermal cameras. It wasn't until we got further, so past halfway, then we could start to see the heat signatures of Buck and Al. So it definitely wasn't Buck and Al. It definitely was not Dean and Steve down in the creek, because they were still in the creek when they radioed through to say what just happened. So whatever it was neither of us.
It was a very interesting night, to say the least. Thank you for joining us on our journey. Along with the physical signs and audible noises throughout the night, the bipedal walking of our visitors in the creek bed, the rocks possibly being thrown, and the visuals experienced by Buck and Al and Gary, we feel this location will warrant more AYR attention in the future. It's a numbers game. The more times you're out there, the more you increase the odds of crossing paths with what we've come to refer to as the Yowie.